everyone, and welcome to your spring wreath tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me, I'm so excited. If you are watching this before you've actually received your box, that's absolutely fine. Your flowers will be quite thirsty when they reach you, so please make sure that as soon as that box gets to you, as soon as you can, remove those flowers and the foliage from the box, cut the stems off. I always recommend a good inch, and get them into some nice, clean, fresh water, and put them somewhere in a dark, cool spot in your house that they can really rest and just rehydrate, and they will really thank you for it because they'll be much easier to work with. Your flowers are going to last much longer in your wreath. So that's the first thing to do. So if you haven't done that, then please make sure that you go and do that first. And then what I recommend is that you leave them there for a good, I would ideally say overnight. If you're desperate to work with them, give them at least 4 to 6 hours to drink. And they will, they, like I said, really thank you for it. So I'm going to sort of go straight into it from here. And the first thing I'm going to come to talk about is the wreath base that we're going to be using to make our wreath. So we're going to be using this floral oasis foam. This is something new that they've recently designed that is more sustainable. It is biodegradable. Mine is brown, yours may also be brown, it might be green, there is no difference, so don't panic about that. And we simply need to wet all of this foam in order to make sure that all of our flowers can have a drink whilst it's hanging on our doors looking pretty. And this is what allows us to use fresh flowers and to enable them to last as long as possible. So I've got a nice big fill sink here with just some fresh, cool water. It's not hot, it's not like cold. I've mixed hot and cold. And I'm just gonna place the foam on top. So I don't know if you want to come in. And you don't dunk it at all, you just sort of leave it to float. And you will notice that all these bubbles are going to start emerging now. And ideally you just want to leave this for 1 to 3 minutes. Absolutely no more than that is necessary. You'll notice that the bubbles will sort of stop, and that's when all the water's been absorbed. I've heard of people leaving these in water for overnight. It's really not necessary, and you'll actually do the foam more harm than good, because once you put your stems in, it will start to all break away and come apart. So you want to maximum 3 minutes. So I'm going to leave that there and just talk to you about what we're using here today. So everything that I'm using here today, we're actually filming this about 3 or 4 weeks in advance to when you're receiving yours. So if your flowers are slightly different to mine, that is only because I haven't been able to get hold of exactly what I've got here. And so I hope you can appreciate that. But rest assured, I will have chosen something as much closely as I can get to what I've got here. And yeah, hopefully you agree that they're just as beautiful. So we've got some clematis here and some zingy green chrysanthemums, as well as some viburnum, some genestra, which smells incredible if you open your box, some hellebores, some beautiful white ranunculus, and then a selection of foliage over here. So I've got some pittosporum, some rosemary, and then some eucalyptus there. And then so all you really need is a pair of scissors, and we're going to be hanging the wreath just using this garden twine, and we're going to be hanging this very shortly once this has drank up all its water. So you can kind of now see that the bubbles are really slowly stopping now. There's not as many of them as there were, so that should be absolutely fine. I'm not sure exactly how long that's been, but I'm just going to lift it out. So I haven't touched it at all since it's been in. Just going to lift it out carefully, and it's very heavy now, which is perfect. That's what you need. And you're just going to turn it over. And we're just going to place it on our workbench, and that's fine. So I've just got a little towel here just to make sure that nothing's wet around there or anything. And I always recommend that you work on somewhere like a little bit more elevated. It's just handy on the back. Dining tables can feel a little bit low. So like I said, we're going to be hanging this with the twine, and we're going to do this now because once all our flowers and foliage are in there, it's going to be quite difficult, and we don't want to budge any of the stems once they're nice and in. So I'm just going to be placing this underneath, and it doesn't really matter where you do this, and just going to be tying that right at the top there. And you'll notice that the string is going to make an indentation in our foam, and that's fine. And I'm just going to knot that at the top like so, and then you can put another little knot at the top that you can hang on your door. So obviously your door may need a longer piece of string. You may have a wreath hook or a wreath hanger, or you might be using a command hook. There are lots of different ways that you can hang your wreath, but I just know that my knocker isn't that high, so I can have that quite low and just snip off the excess there. And then we don't have to worry about that. The only thing we do need to consider is, as we are designing, is that is the top. So try and always keep your string out of the way so that you remember as you're designing which way is the top, because sometimes wreaths can feel like they've got a definitive top and bottom. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to start placing our foliage and flowers now that we've done the technical stuff. So the Pittosporum is what we're going to be using first, and you'll notice this is very branchy and quite bushy, and we just want to trim off all of the little branches because we want to make the most of them all, and we don't waste any of it. I mean, that's what I'm wasting on there, and then you can just discard of the stems. It's always handy to have a little bin close by or a compost bag as you are making something like this. And you just want to create a nice little pile of your foliage. You can do all of your foliage at the same time if you want to. And like here where I've left this one, that wouldn't look very pretty in a wreath. So I'm just going to snip that piece off and just use that. It's quite therapeutic doing this. And do take your time. Making wreaths is so lovely. I'm even going to use this top piece. So now that you've got these little pile here, we can go ahead and put them into our foam. Now, in terms of how much you want to put into the foam, I would say about that much is perfect, about an inch. And we're going to be doing everything at a direction that we are comfortable with. So some of you might feel better doing everything this way, or you might feel better doing it this way. It's totally up to you. I like to go in this way. And there's no real exact science to this. On this stem, for example, there are some leaves at the bottom which would end up going into the foam. So I want to remove those leaves off just to make sure that the flower and the foliage stem has a source of water at all times. And don't forget about the sides of your foam. So you want to be making sure that you're doing everything quite even. And you can retrim here. And just think about the height, and some things in the wreath are going to be much lower down and some things are going to be coming out a little bit. So yeah, just have a think about when you're placing them in. This piece is much bigger and I'm not going to be, too precious about them all being the same. I like that this piece is coming up a little bit. It's going to add interest to the design. I don't like things to be too symmetrical, even though it is a circle. And you just want to do it quite evenly so that you know that you've got enough of this to go all the way around your wreath. And there's plenty to go in them. So if you even wanted to leave some of it until you decide, you'll go back and add some more in. That's absolutely fine. I do like to sometimes leave little bits because you want some of the flowers to be the showstoppers and you don't want it to be completely covered with greenery. But it is good to give it a little bit of a base of your greens first, just to start building that shape and design. I love the colour of these with the little touches of ivory on the edges. It just really works well with the flowers that we're going to be using. So I'm just going in with some of the really little stems so we don't waste anything, especially around the edges. And you can see that all of my stems are going in this one direction here. And that's what you're aiming for. And don't forget about this inside as well. Perfect. So it does look a little bit strange at first and you'll start to think this isn't looking like much, but as you start to build in the different foliage and eventually the flowers, it really does just all start to come together really beautifully. Now the rosemary is a bit tougher, so just make sure you've got a nice pair of strong snips. And I'm going to be using even these little pieces here. We will be removing the lower leaves off them. Love the scent of rosemary, and it's just such a beautiful texture to add into your wreath. And some of the rosemary you might find you might have a little bit of a purpley flower on them, which is a lovely touch considering we're using all of kind of these deep purpley pinky blooms. So yeah, a really nice springy colour after all the Christmas and winter, and yeah, really nice. And I'm not being too precious about the lengths that I'm cutting these in. You know, they're relatively similar, but don't worry if some of them are a bit bigger. You don't want them, just have a look at your wreath, you don't want them to be too long. You want them to sort of sit in. This one is particularly bushy, so stems like this I'm going to remove first, just because it's a bit easier to then work with the whole stem. Some of these are very woody. You've got to put your back into it a little bit to get through these stems. If you've got a pair of secateurs, go and grab them. Great. Now with the rosemary, they are very leafy at the end, so just make sure that you're simply stripping them leaves off so that you've got a nice good inch of clean stem before you go and place this into your foam. And then I'm just going to be interspersing this into the foam as I did with the pittosporum at the beginning. And with the bigger stems, they are quite chunky, so just make sure that they feel nice and sturdy before you let go. And what you'll notice as well is the more stems that we put in here, you might find that some of the stems actually start to touch other stems inside the foam. And we don't want to do that too often because it will form a weakness within the foam. So as much as you can kind of space things out nice and evenly, the better. We don't want to be bunching things in. Just smells amazing. See, I've just hit another stem of the pittosporum there, and you can see that I've now made a hole in that, which is fine, don't worry. Just don't try and go back into that same spot. Just move somewhere next to it and it will get covered as we go around. So lots of nice little pieces here that are really handy to cover in this middle section in particular. I've got quite a few nice pieces here that I can use. And with the colour being brown, it's obviously a natural colour, or green if you've got green, and it, you know, it is well hidden, even if there are some small pieces that you may have missed. So don't panic too much. But it's good to just sort of, even if you try and turn your wreath as you're doing it, and have a good look. Okay, so I'm going to leave these, my little pile of leftovers for now, in case I want to add any in as we go along. Now we're going to move on to the eucalyptus. So the eucalyptus has quite large leaves, really, so we want to be considerate as we're placing these. We want to really think about where they're going, and particularly when we're putting in the flowers, that they don't cover up the beauty of the flowers. So it's just something to bear in mind. And I'm even going to use this because they're nice and big, they do tend to cover a large surface area, particularly around the edges. So yeah, don't discard anything. Lovely, really lovely big ones here. You could also add anything, foliage that you may have in your gardens at the moment, olive trees or any sort of yew, anything that was kind of around at Christmas. If you have conifers or anything, just to add that sort of interest. You might have some nice like contorted willow or hazel twigs or something in your garden that would be a beautiful addition to something like this. So my string to the top of my wreath is actually down here, so I'm just going to make sure that I move that. Just keep reminding myself of where that top of the wreath is. And just like we've done with all the others, just go in and place in your eucalyptus. Now I'm noticing I've got quite a bit of a gap here, so I definitely want to just add in some of I've got a nice big piece that I'd left of my pittosporum here, so I'm just going to make sure that I cover that now. I just feel like it looked a bit sparse, and then carry on. And I tend to, with larger leaves and things, is put them in lower into the arrangement so that they sort of hide below and they sort of peek through. So particularly like I'm doing here with this one, this is sort of like a nice coverage for the side of the wreath that you would see from all angles, as you do when you're approaching your door. And some of the leaves will be smaller, so feel free to put them inside. And there really is no, sort of science to adding in your foliage or anything. Just enjoy the process, enjoy thinking about where they need to go, and yeah, there's definitely something really lovely about making your own wreath. Just going to pop a bit of him. Okay, so I'm going to leave these little pieces of greenery over there just in case I feel like I want to use them later on. And now we can start adding in our flowers. So the first thing I'm going to be placing in are the two largest flowers that we're using. So I've got these viburnums and then these chrysanthemums. So with the viburnums, we can use some of this foliage as well, so certainly don't throw that away. So I've just snipped that off there. I'm just going to remove those two lower leaves and see sort of how high I need it. You might be surprised at how long I'm cutting these stems actually. I think sort of traditionally with like Christmas wreaths and when they used foam, they would put them like right in, but you really can get away with having them a little bit longer, and it makes your wreath that little bit fuller and more sort of exuberant. So yeah, feel free to cut them as you wish. Now because this is quite a big focal flower, consider its placement. Bear in mind that where your top of your wreath went. And I'm going to do the other one. And I've placed this one quite sort of facing forward, but with this one, because I don't want them to be sort of exact copies of each other, I'm going to place it at more of an angle so that you see more of the side of this one. Now, I'm not going to use these yet, but this greenery is perfect for covering any sides that we may have later. So put that to one side. Obviously discard of any of the leaves that aren't as lovely. This one's even got a nice little bud on it. Again, them stems are quite chunky. Always cut your stems at an angle, particularly if they're very chunky. And as I go along, if I find any little gaps or just another lovely green to add to the arrangement. And then I'm going to go going with my chrysanthemums. And again with these, you have these like sort of buds on the side shoots, so use them. So let's not waste any, so they're going to go in. I'm just cutting that flower stem off at a nice angle. And I'm not going to use these leaves because these leaves are very thirsty and they're going to need lots of water and they're going to wilt quite quickly. So I'm going to discard of those in the compost. I'm going to remove those leaves as well. And then just the same as the viburnum, it's going in above there. And I think I'm going to have this one relatively close but at more of an angle in the arrangement. And I like how that's being covered a little bit but not too much, so it's just sort of peeping through, whereas this one's a bit bigger. And I typically, so I've put this bigger one lower into the arrangement and I've let the smaller one stand out because bigger things in a wreath like this might just look a little bit like they've been placed there, so I want them to feel like it's sort of growing in a garden, which is why I've covered it. So compost in there. And snip the ends of these and definitely use them. And I'm going to use them right near the chrysanthemum. So again, it looks like it's growing. Oh, I've actually broken this one, so this one won't be used. The next thing I'm going to go in and use is my hellebores. So you may have something different to these. You may have anemones, which will work in exactly the same way as the hellebores. They are quite thick-stemmed flowers, both anemones and hellebores, and they are very thirsty. So I've left these in the water until it was the time to use them, just to really give them that final drink up. And they do have these beautiful buds on them as well, which I'm going to use. So trimming off those stems, and another one, and the same here. Probably a bit too long, so I'm just going to trim him off. So even just out of 2 stems, I've got them 4 lovely pops of colour that I'm going to be using within the wreath. And just when you're starting to use more delicate flowers, I always try and hold the stem close to the end as you're pushing it into the floral foam. It just gives it that, that strength that it needs to make sure that you don't bend or accidentally break, and you want to push them in quite slowly. Much more care than you're doing with the foliage. And I just absolutely love how the inner colour of these hellebores is just mirroring the colour of these chrysanthemums. It's almost like that zingy, acid yellow-green. And then the buds are going to go in as well. Just sort of hear it squeaking as it goes in. And it's also really important when you're doing something like this to make sure that once the flowers are in the foam, try not to move them. It's really important that they stay where they are. So that's why it's important to consider where you're putting them before you place them in. Then I'm going to go and do the ranunculus. And again on these, you get these lovely buds. This one's got 3 actually. So I'm definitely going to be using them. Now I'm just I've cut these stems quite long actually, and I'm just having a little look and thinking they're going to be a bit too long because even with an inch in, they're going to be poking out of my wreath a bit too much. But I would always say start with too much and then cut down, because you can't add the stem back on once you've cut it. And these will get bigger as the wreath ages. It's even a bit too long. And again, these are particularly kind of, I call them like juicy stems. So yeah, really gently push them into the floral foam. About This one's really juicy, so I'm going to have to cut it much shorter. And just guide it in. And these buds, just beautiful. I think the smaller things are nice to come out of the wreath that bit more. It doesn't matter too much, because they're just smaller and they just add that sort of interest to the whole wreath. Perfect. So we've got another little variety of our hellebores here. This is called Winter Bells, and this is very branchy sort of stem. As you can see, there's quite a few different branches on here that we're going to be cutting off to use. And they're quite a droopy flower. If you've got these in your garden, you'll notice that they're very hardy. They're very good with very cold temperatures. We've got one in the garden actually, and it's been snowing here all week. And it's completely flattened, but after the snow's gone, they will just sort of recover. They're very good at that. But the sort of best thing to do if you want to bring this sort of a flower into your home to enjoy from your garden is to wait until the middle stamen have fallen off the flower. And you'll see here, these stamen have fallen off. So this is one with it's still almost intact, and this is one where it's completely fallen off. And this stem feels much waxier and hardier than this one. So this may perform better in my wreath than one like this, which is completely the stamen are all still intact. So just a little top tip for you on hellebore. I'm going to leave these longer leaves on because I quite like them, and you'll notice that as they're very droopy, they're quite funny to work with on foam. So just work with them and just make sure that you're showing off the hellebore as much as possible. Sometimes it's nice to see the back of things. Just have a play and, you know, sort of see where you feel it looks most beautiful. Just love the colour of these. They've got the softest touch of pink. And because the stems are also sort of replicating this colour of the other hellebore, they just work together really lovely. I've got a bit of a gap here, and it's been bothering me. And I thought I might be able to fill it with one of my hellebores, but actually I think it needs a bit more than just a flower. So I'm going to use our viburnum greenery that we had earlier, and I'm going to actually pop 2 in just around the edge there. And that's just instantly sort of filled that space for me. Okay, so those are hellebores in. I'm going to use even more of this stuff now that we've sort of started to build up much more of a shape and most of the flowers are in. I've got a few sprigs of my rosemary and things left, so I'm just going to add those in just to cover any major bits of the foam that you can still see. So we've still got some clematis to put in. And this is quite a lovely green bushy stem, but again with the foliage with these, they do like a lot to drink. So we are just going to be working with the flowers in particular and snipping them off. I'm just discarding of those. And they're just so pretty, and I like to put these in at the end because I feel like they really need to be seen. Lovely. And then finally we've got our Genestra, which just smells amazing, and it's just got this tiniest sort of deep purple on the bud of them flowers, which just brings everything together. And it's just a whole stem of just like loads and loads of stems that we can cut off. So I'm just going to snip these all off, and I'm going to leave these quite long because I think they'll be nice sort of singing out of the arrangement. And like I said, like at this point, if you've got any pussy willow or contorted willow, hazel, all of those sort of springy, lovely things, catkins would make it look like rustic. Yeah, feel free to poke those in at this sort of stage as well, because they'll really add another dimension to your wreath. There's so many on these that we can use. Just taking our time to snip them all. I actually can't get over the fragrance of this particular variety. It's been in our utility, and every time I go in there, it just smells amazing. And this, the final piece at the end that you get is much bushier with shorter stems, so keep that and use that somewhere in the wreath as well. So I feel like I've got quite a big sort of white element going on here with my viburnum. So I'm going to actually put this sort of away from them too, just to try and bring them whites together. In there. And then we can just pop these all in everywhere. I just think they're quite nice, scattered around the sides, throughout the middle. And in terms of how long this is likely to last, if you watched the live, you may have seen one that I made, and it still looked lovely 3 weeks later. So it is dependent on the weather a little bit, and it's been particularly cold here. Actually too cold for some of the flowers, but they've still been absolutely fine. We have a covered porch, which is still exposed to the outside, but it's been -4 or 5 in the evenings, and they look exactly as they did when I put them in 3 weeks ago. So yeah, this really can last quite some time, and you can try and put more water into the foam if you wanted to. I prefer to just leave them because we know that they've had a good soak and a drink. I just think that they're fine, and I've never had any problems in doing it that way before. And you might actually cause more damage by trying to water the foam, and some of the flowers won't like having direct water on them. I've heard about some people misting them as well. Again, I personally don't bother with this technique. I just feel like it's unnecessary, and again, does more damage than good. So I just quite like some of these stems just sort of poking out the top on this side, so I'm just going to try and make sure I get the same on the other. It just adds that pretty detail that our doors need this spring. And hopefully at this point, you know, it's getting quite difficult to see any of the foam, and you're building up and you're just really happy with it, and yeah, take your time in, you know, when you put in each thing, you know, feel free to sort of take a step back from the design and come back to it. Go and have a walk, cup of tea, whatever you sort of need to do. I sometimes think coming back with a fresh pair of eyes if you're stuck or anything can really, really help. I've had to do it many times myself. And it is amazing what just walking away from something and coming back to it can do. So I will hold it up for you. So I was just left with this little pile of foliage that I don't need to use, so that's fine. I'm going to discard of that. And we've got our wreath. So the top of it was obviously where I've placed this at the beginning. I won't hold it completely up because what will happen is that this will drip. So I recommend that you carry this to your door on its back, and when you hang it up, you could place a towel at the bottom of your door just to let that excess water drip. It will probably drip for potentially up to sort of an hour or possibly more, and that's absolutely fine. It's completely normal. It's just the excess water because we've now put flowers into the foam. If you imagine a sponge, some of that water's got to escape, so that will be why it drips. So don't panic too much, and if you've got a door that you don't want to you know, get damaged or anything, hang it up somewhere else and let that then drips until it's dry, and then hang it on your door. And yeah, I just hope that you've really enjoyed making your wreath, and I hope that it brings you lots of happiness and joy in watching it sort of change and develop over the coming days and weeks. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again soon.